It's time to walk the walk when it comes to the oath to the Constitution. On this episode, I'm going to break down the top 5 most crucial steps that an oath-keeping president should take to radically preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution starting now. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Boldin with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Friday, November 8th, 2024. And before we start exercising our oath-keeping muscles, let's kick it off with just a little warm-up. What does it mean to keep one's oath, to honor it? And for that, let's look to St. George Tucker in his great view of the Constitution of the United States. He said, acts of Congress to be binding must be made pursuant to the Constitution. Otherwise, they are not laws, but a mere nullity, or what is worse, acts of usurpation. Now, here's the money shot. The people are not only not bound by them, but the several departments and officers of the government, both federal and state, are bound by oath to oppose them. For being bound by oath to support the Constitution, they must violate that oath whenever they give their sanction by obedience or otherwise to any unconstitutional act of any department of the government. Man, that really hammers it home and sums up what it means to adhere to one's oath. If you want to learn a little bit more about that from the founding generation, I covered it in much more detail in an episode just a few days ago. Oath to the Constitution, Ignored and Betrayed Daily at the Cost of Liberty is the title. That'll be linked to in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, and it'll be published just a couple of hours after this live stream is done. And with that, let's get to, I guess I've got a top 5 countdown of these really essential, these crucial steps that an oath-keeping president should take or would take if they are an oath keeper. And the first one is work to reduce the debt. Here's how Brutus, the great anti-federalist writer, put it in his 8th paper. I can scarcely contemplate a greater calamity that could befall this country than to be loaded with a debt exceeding their ability ever to discharge. And if that does not already sound familiar to what we live under, it was really, really, really close. So this is a very incredibly dangerous situation. No calamity could be greater than this, according to Brutus. But it wasn't just the anti-federalists. Here's George Washington on the Federalist side. Here he is in his 5th annual message to Congress, 1793. No pecuniary consideration is more urgent than the regular redemption and discharge of the public debt. On none can delay be more injurious or an economy of time more valuable. That means no more of these big budget proposals that fund all kinds of, or propose to fund all kinds of unconstitutional programs. No more urging money printing or manipulation of markets through the Federal Reserve. No more overspending, no more borrowing beyond what is taken in. Basically a balanced budget without, just do it. And no more signing anything from Congress that pushes you to go beyond that. And I'll get to the signing of things in just a moment. So number 5 is work to reduce the debt. Number 4 is cultivate peace. We can't force peace because that's not peaceful, but we can cultivate it. Here's how George Washington put it in his farewell address, tying together the paying off of the debt with strong national security and strong national security with working to cultivate peace. As a very important source of strength and security, cherish public credit, said Washington. And I would have to point out that $37 trillion and growing of national debt is nowhere close, even remotely, to cherishing public credit. That has to change. It's going to hurt, but it has to change almost immediately. Washington continued, one method of preserving it, the public credit, is to use it as sparingly as possible, avoiding occasions of expense by cultivating peace. But remembering also that timely disbursements to prepare for danger frequently prevent much greater disbursements to repel it. And he's saying, look, if you pay down the debt, you're stronger. You're not stuck in a situation. And then if you need to, you can take on debt in, times of danger. He said, avoid likewise the accumulation of debt, not only by shunning occasions of expense, so shun all of them, but by vigorous exertion in time of peace to discharge the debts which unavoidable wars may have occasioned, not ungenerously throwing upon posterity the burden which we ourselves ought to bear. For Washington, paying off the debt or working in that direction was a moral imperative. Leaving it to future generations and continue to spend was totally immoral, and it's certainly, well, an oath keeper would not continue that at all. More from Washington. He said, it is our true policy, again, we're talking about cultivating peace, and so then he's talking about foreign policy. It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliance with any portion of the foreign world. And one more from Washington on how we cultivate peace and, well, work towards more prosperity. The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible. Now, I believe Thomas Jefferson did cite Washington's farewell address as an inspiration for his first inaugural address in 1801, where he used the word peace at least 6 or 7 times in a really short address. These were not really long back then, and he used it a bunch of times. Peace was a very important thing for Thomas Jefferson, and this is a great summary of what he had to say. Peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. I covered the foreign policy of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson in an episode that I really think you should check out from earlier this year. That'll also be linked to in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. So number 5, reduce the debt, work to reduce the debt. 4 is cultivate peace. Number 3 is, well, if we're talking about working to reduce the debt, well, even if you use your bully pulpit to try to pressure them into spending less, if your budget proposal says we got to just cut all this spending because none of it's constitutional anyways, they're probably going to send you a bunch of garbage anyways. So what do? Well, number 3 is veto everything. I mean, if you think of the idea that under the Constitution, the federal government is only authorized to exercise a set of few and defined powers, as James Madison put it in Federalist 45, and everything else is reserved to the state. Those are numerous and indefinite powers. Almost everything that they do is unconstitutional in the first place. So if you just basically veto everything, you're right 9 out of 10 times. If you sign everything, you're wrong 9 out of 10 times. So I believe it's 100% certain that no matter what a president says or does today, Congress is going to send to their desk all kinds of unconstitutional legislation, budget, spending, omnibus, whatever they want to call it. My recommendation then is just if you want to make it easy, veto everything, because there is no such thing as what they like to call must pass legislation. We should never hear from any oath-keeping president that, well, I don't like a lot of what they're doing, but they included this national defense part, so even though they have these other social programs in there that aren't supposed to exist, I'm going to sign it anyways because it's so important. None of that stuff should ever happen. And on the screen here, I have, the first veto ever issued. I think this was George Washington, April of 1792. This is for a bill called an Act for an Apportionment of Representatives among the Several States. I believe the veto that survives, the original document, is in Thomas Jefferson's handwriting. I'm not 100% certain on that, but it was Jefferson, Attorney General Edmund Randolph, along with James Madison, which really urged in response to Henry Knox and Alexander Hamilton, who were saying, sign this thing. Those three were saying, no, you just can't do it. Now, it focused on policy, the reason for vetoing it, not on policy, but on the Constitution is what I'm trying to say here. First, these are the reasons why I'm sending it back, said George Washington. The Constitution has prescribed that representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers. And there is no one proportion or divisor which applied to the respective numbers of the states will yield the number and allotment of representatives proposed by the bill. In other words, the goal of the bill to do something may have been good according to George Washington, but the method to do it violated the Constitution. He agreed with Thomas Jefferson and others on this. Second, the Constitution has also provided that the number of representatives shall not exceed 1 for every 30,000. which restriction is, by the context and by fair and obvious construction, to be applied to the separate and respective numbers of the states, and the bill has allotted to 8 of the states more than one for 30,000. So straight up, this is violating the Constitution. Whatever creative math you may come up with, try to defeat it, to tell me I should sign it. He decided to say no. So ultimately, veto all this stuff and explain why, well, if you can, why it is a violation of the Constitution as well. Then on the other end of the spectrum, well, not really the political spectrum, but some years later, we have James Madison, who on his very last day in office used his veto power to say no to an infrastructure bill. This was something that he politically advocated in favor of for power for the federal government for about 30 years at this point, if not a little longer. But what they sent him to sign on his last day in office, it, well, assumed power for the federal government that was not authorized by the Constitution. So he vetoed it, even though it would have been very easy for him politically to just either sign it, come up with a reason to sign it, or as he was urged by the Speaker of the House, just do nothing. We'll leave it to the next guy. We'll leave it to Monroe, and we can try to convince him to sign it. And Madison had every out to just avoid his oath and go with his political preferences. Instead, he stuck with his oath to the Constitution. I covered that also in some detail in an episode just last month, Most Important and Most Ignored Veto in History. I explain why I think it hits those standards. James Madison's last stand. So number 3 in our countdown is, well, veto everything or pretty much everything. At least start thinking about using that veto power way, way more. No more excuses to sign must-pass legislation. That's garbage. Now, for number 2, let's first go back to Tucker to hammer home the oath. They must violate that oath, he wrote, whenever they give their sanction by obedience or otherwise to any unconstitutional act of any department of the government. Now, some people will tell us, well, it's only part of the federal government that can tell everybody. The rest of the federal government, all the branches, all the people who work for the federal government, all the states, and the rest of the people, what's constitutional or not. But that is not how the founding generation understood this system. That might make for another good episode if you're interested in that. But here's James Madison in a letter to, we don't know, but in December of 1834. He put it like this: as the legislative, executive, and judicial departments of the U.S. are coordinate, they're equal in the amount of how they are on the food chain, and each is equally bound to support the Constitution, it follows that each must, in the exercise of its functions, be guided by the text of the Constitution according to its own interpretation of it. So the Supreme Court may have an opinion on something, but they don't have enforcement powers. The Congress might have an opinion on something they pass, but they can't sign it into law. I mean, they can override a veto, but you see how you create these checks and balances by, rather than just deferring to one branch and making that branch superior to all the others, each branch is supposed to, and also all the states, are supposed to act according to their own view of how the Constitution is structured. That's James Madison, the father of the Constitution. Here's Thomas Jefferson in a letter to Spencer Roane with a very similar take. My construction of the Constitution, he wrote, is that each department is truly independent of the others and has an equal right to decide for itself what is the meaning of the Constitution in the cases submitted to its action. Now, it's not up to the executive branch. I mean, you can opine on it, but they can't actually have any impact on something that's before the Supreme Court, for example, or the federal courts. So you can have an opinion and express that, but when it comes to enforcement or not, implementation or not, if the executive branch feels that something is unconstitutional, the only way to follow their oath is not wait for someone else to agree with you, but to take a stand even if everybody disagrees with you. And so that's how Jefferson put it. Each department is truly independent of the others and has an equal right to decide for itself what the meaning of the Constitution in the cases submitted to its action, and especially where it is to act ultimately and without appeal. And an 1804 letter to Abigail Adams President Thomas Jefferson at that time explained how he put this exact principle into practice against the very hated Sedition Acts of 1798. And here's how he put it. I discharged every person under punishment or prosecution under the sedition law, because I considered and now consider that law to be a nullity as absolute and as palpable as if Congress had ordered us to fall down and worship a golden image. He had a way with words, that Thomas Jefferson. And he said, and that it was as much my duty to arrest its execution in every stage. At every turn possible, Jefferson said that it was under his oath to the Constitution to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. It's his job. He swears an oath to say, I'm going to follow the Constitution no matter what anybody else says. That means it's his job to try to stop the execution of what he sees as an unconstitutional act, like punishing or restricting free speech. He said, and it was as much my duty to arrest its execution in every stage as it would have been to have rescued from the fiery furnace those who should have been cast into it for refusing to worship their image. It was accordingly done in every instance, without asking what the offenders had done or against whom they had offended, but whether the pains they were suffering were inflicted under the pretended sedition law. So someone else signed it into law before him. He gets into office. It's still on the books. He sees it as null and void. It's a pretended law. It's not a real law. And so therefore, as the executive, it's now his job to make sure that that act does not get enforced at every stage possible. So number 2 on this list is refuse to enforce. And we can think of so many areas. I'm sure you can think of a few I'd love to see in the comments. I'm thinking like 4473 violations. You can do this in large numbers. Just stop enforcing this stuff that violates the Constitution. And that also ties in to number 1. For everyone else already being punished for violating unconstitutional acts, usurpations of power, use the pardon power and use it widely all over the place. Here's how Tucker put it. The power of pardon, which is vested in the executive, in its turn, constitutes a proper check upon the too great rigor or abuse of power in the judiciary department. So when the judiciary is saying these people should be convicted for whatever, for violating some act that was passed by Congress or signed by a previous executive, when you're in office, well, you use the pardon to set those people free. It's like jury nullification. They may be able to convict a zillion people, but if all of them are set free, that law is null and void in practice, as it should be. So that is a check on abuse by the judiciary and also abuse by Congress and previous presidents. It can also be used as just an act of justice, like, okay, we understand this situation, I'm going to set this person free. Or it was known in English history, where it was really derived from under the Constitution as the prerogative of mercy. So it can be used for justice reasons, for just issuing mercy to someone. And here in Federalist number 74, Alexander Hamilton explained a very important reason for the pardon power. He said, but the principal argument for opposing the power of pardoning in this case to the chief magistrate is this. In seasons of insurrection or rebellion, there are often critical moments when a well-timed offer of pardon to the insurgents or rebels may restore the tranquility of the Commonwealth, and which, if suffered to pass unimproved, it may never be possible afterwards to recall. And that's exactly what President Washington did. A general pardon at the end of the so-called Whiskey Rebellion. Up here on the screen, I have Washington's proclamation of pardons in Western Pennsylvania from July of 1795. You'll definitely want to read this in full. It's not really long, but let me read this short piece of it. I, George Washington, President of the said United States, have granted, and by these presents do grant, a full, free, and entire pardon to all persons, excepting as is hereinafter accepted, all treasons, misprisions of treason, and other indictable offenses against the United States committed within the 4th Survey of Pennsylvania before the 22nd day of August last past. And he continues, it's not just for people who have already been convicted. He's getting people who are waiting this. He said, and now standeth indicted or convicted of any treason, misprision of treason, or other offense against the said United States, hereby remitting and releasing unto all persons, except as before accepted, all penalties incurred or supposed to be incurred for or on account of the premises. So using a broad-based pardon under the pardon power, just like Hamilton described in Federalist 74, was a smart political move. It showed a willingness to move forward, and it was a time of difficulty. Whatever side you take on that, it doesn't matter. This here shows how the pardon power is supposed to be used. And Thomas Jefferson did the same thing in response to the Sedition Acts as well. And here he's describing that further in his letter to Spencer Roane. He said a legislature had passed the sedition law. The federal courts had subjected certain individuals to its penalties of fine and imprisonment. So the sedition law was passed in 1798. Some people were already convicted under it. And then he comes into office in 1801. And what is he going to do about this? He said, on coming into office, I released these individuals by the power of pardon committed to the executive discretion, which could never be more properly exercised than where citizens were suffering without the authority of law, or which was equivalent under a law unauthorized by the Constitution and therefore null. So if you are an oath-keeping president and you are there to protect, preserve, and defend the Constitution, you are going to look at basically anyone and everyone who has ever been convicted for some act that was never authorized by the Constitution, and you use your power of pardon. Thomas Jefferson thought, well, that was the most important way that it should be used. It was, he said, which could never be more properly exercised than in a situation when they were suffering because of a law unauthorized by the Constitution and therefore null and void. So we need to see a power to pardon used en masse. And I know all 5 of these are a pretty high bar, but if we ever want to live in a real land of the free, rather than under the largest government in history, maybe it's time for we the people to up our standards. Not just a little bit, but a lot. Raise our standards, and at least, even if we don't expect any of this to happen, at least start putting it out there for the long term, whether they're achievable in the coming days, months, or years or not. And with the Constitution as our standard here at the 10th Amendment Center, this is what we work to do every single day. And absolutely nothing helps us get this job done more than the financial faith and support of our members. So if you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat that they keep devaluing by printing too much and spending and borrowing and all that stuff, please consider throwing it our way over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Our membership program starts out at just $2 a month, but when a bunch of people chip in, we can do really great work. We punch way above our weight class here at the TAC. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I'd be very grateful for any consideration you can give to join us as a member today. You can also do a few free and easy peasy things to help us spread the word, like smashing the like button, subscribing, getting notifications, comments in the archive, reviews on whatever podcast platform like Apple Podcasts, etc. All those things can trigger the algorithms of these platforms and tell them to show us to more people. And while I'm here, just one more quick moment to say a huge but quick thank you to just a handful of people who have joined us as members. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I'm very grateful for your support. There's Bernie in Arizona, Yvonne in Wisconsin, Steve in Michigan, Roger also in Wisconsin. That's my original home state. Thank you guys. Wisconsin, that is. Sean in Tennessee, Lindsay in Massachusetts, and James in Colorado. I'm very grateful for your support. I'm very grateful that you decided to spend some of your time with me here today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it made you think. I hope you learned something. That's more important than anything. Hope you have an awesome weekend. I got a bunch of great episodes scheduled for next week, so I look forward to seeing you then here on the path to liberty.